Buenos días, buenas tardes o buenas
Hello,
noches,
good morning,
dependiendo
good
a qué hora
afternoon, or
nos
good
están
evening,
viendo esta
depending on
grabación.
where you
Mi
are.
nombre es
My name is
Pamela
Pamela
Desjardins
Desjardins,
y antes que
and
nada quiero
first of all,
agradecer
I'd like to thank you very
enormemente la
much for
oportunidad de
allowing me
poder
to
participar
participate
de
in this
este
event.
evento.
It is an
Es
honor
un
and
honor y un
pleasure.
placer. Bueno, la ponencia que tengo preparada
The
es parte de una
presentation
investigación
that I
que
prepared stems
vengo
from
desarrollando ya
research
hace
I've been
tiempo,
carrying out for some
pero que
time.
nació más como una
It
investigación
began as part of a
curatorial, digamos,
curatorial
como parte de un proyecto
project,
curatorial y que tuvo un
which
tiempo,
was on pause for a
en
while, and
pausa y que
now
ahora
I
estoy
have
retomando
taken
como
up again as part
parte
of my
de mi
research
investigación como
as a
estudiante
PhD
dentro del
student in the
programa
art
de
history
doctorado en teoría del
program
arte
of the
de la UNAM,
Autonomous
de la
University of
Universidad Autónoma de
Mexico,
México.
UNAM.
Voy a compartir pantalla
Okay, and
para
now I will share my
presentar
screen
la
to begin the
ponencia
presentation,
que
which is
lleva
called
por
Critical
título Investigación
Imagination,
Crítica,
the
los primeros
first
museos de arte
contemporary art
contemporáneo
museums
en tres
in
ciudades
3 Latin
de
American
América
cities.
Latina.
Like I mentioned
Bueno, como
before,
mencionaba
the starting points of
anteriormente,
this
la presente
presentation
ponencia
are some of the
toma como
inquiries and
punto de
categories
partida
proposed for ongoing
algunas de las
research
indagaciones y
focused
categorías
on 3 initiatives
planteadas para
that
una
are
investigación en
considered the
curso
first
centrada en
contemporary
tres
art
iniciativas
museums
que se
in their
erigen como
cities
los primeros
during the
museos de
first
arte
2 decades of
contemporáneo
the 21st
de sus
century.
ciudades durante las primeras
Limac
2 décadas del siglo XXI.
in Lima,
El
La
LIMAC,
N
Museo de Arte Contemporáneo
in
de
Buenos
Lima,
Aires,
la N,
and
Nuevo
El
Museo de
Numu
Poesía de Arte Contemporáneo
in
de Buenos
Guatemala
Aires,
City.
y el NUMU, Nuevo Museo de Arte Contemporáneo de
Now
la
I
ciudad
will
de Guatemala.
briefly present
Voy a
each of these
pasar a
cases.
describir muy brevemente cada uno de los casos.
Limac,
El LIMAC,
created by
creado por
artist
la
Sandra
artista Sandra
Gamarra in
Gamarra en
2002, does
2002,
not have a
no
fixed
cuenta con una
physical
sede
location,
física
so it
fija,
has
por
existed
lo que
in
ha
various
existido bajo
formats,
diversos
including
formatos,
a
entre los
museum
que se
blanket,
encuentra un museo
where
blanket,
Gamarra places
donde Gamarra
souvenirs
coloca
as we would
souvenirs
find
tal
them
como
in a
los
museum
encontraríamos
shop,
en la tienda
but
de un museo,
emulating a
pero
street
emulando un
shop.
puesto de venta callejero.
Limac has also been
LIMAC
housed
también ha
inside
sido
other
alojado al interior
institutions
de otras
through small
instituciones a través de
architectural
pequeños
devices
dispositivos
or installations,
arquitectónicos,
and in
y
parallel,
en
this
paralelo este
museum has
museo,
organized
ahora
temporary
Museo de
group
Exposiciones
exhibitions
Temporales
in the
dirigido
artist's
en el
studio in
estudio del
Madrid.
artista en la ciudad de Madrid.
On the
Por
other
otro
hand,
lado, la
Limac's
colección de
collection is made up of
LIMAC está
copies of
conformada por
works that
copias de
Gamarra
obras
paints
que Gamarra
following
pinta
images
y las
from art
imágenes
books.
de libros de arte.
At the same
A
time,
su vez,
it has a
cuenta
website
con un
that
sitio
hosts
web de
permanent
albertas
exhibitions
exposiciones
online,
permanentes en línea, material de material
photographic
fotográfico
material
para
of the
sesiones
temporary
temporales
exhibitions,
y un
and an
proyecto arquitectónico
architectural
que
project that
ficciona una
fictionalizes
hipotética
a
sede
hypothetical
permanente
permanent
del museo,
museum
un
headquartered,
edificio
a
enterrado en el
building
desierto de
buried
la
in the
Argentina.
desert on the outskirts
Bueno,
of
aquí
Lima. And here
vemos
we can see
algunas
some of the
imágenes
images of this
de este
hypothetical
hipotético
project.
proyecto de sede fija del IMAC
And here we can
y
see
una
a Gamarra
pintura de
painting
Gamarra en donde ella
where
imagina
she
el
imagines
interior
the
de
inside of
este
this
museo.
museum.
El caso de la N
La N
en
was
realidad
founded in
inicia en
2010 by
2010
artist Gala
con la
Berger
artista
and
Gala
curator
Berger y
Marina
la
Reyes
curadora
Franco,
Marina Reyes Franco,
who were
a
joined
quienes
by
se
artist
sumaron
and
el
curator Santiago
arquitecto Santiago
Villanueva and
Villanueva y la
curator
curadora
Sofia
Sofía
Durron.
Durrón.
La N operated until
Funcionó, la N funciona
2018
como
in a
quien
small
dice
commercial
en
space
un
in
pequeño
Buenos
local
Aires
comercial en
where
Buenos
they held
Aires,
several
donde realizaron
exhibitions,
diversas
many of them
exposiciones, muchas de
historical
ellas de
in
carácter
nature, and
histórico,
they also
y
developed a
desarrollaron un
public
programa
program,
público
Contemporary Art
de
Days,
jornadas de arte
and
contemporáneo en
also an
donde se
art
destina
residency.
residencia para artistas.
Its
El
collection
comercial
is made
está
up of
conformado por
artists'
instructivos de artistas para
instructions
materializar
to
sus piezas en
materialize
una
their
colección.
pieces when required.
Una
A
colección
collection that
que
only,
solo,
open
abro
quote,
citas,
exists in
existe en
memory,
la
can travel
memoria
on a
y
pen
puede
drive
viajar
or
inencontrable en un
USB
disco rígido, en un
drive
papel o en
and
la
on a
cabeza de
hard
un
drive or
artista,
on a piece of
cierro citas.
paper or in a person's head.
Actualmente la N no cuenta
Close
con un
quotation
espacio
marks.
físico,
Currently, La
sin
N does not
embargo
have a
se sigue
physical space.
pensando
However, it
como,
is still
abro
thought
cita,
of
un museo
as
sin
a
sede
museum
donde esa
without a home
información
that
se
is
desmaterializará.
dematerialized information. Numu was
El
created in
NUMU fue creado en el
2012 by
2012
artist
por la
Jessica
artista
Caire and
Jessica
artist
Cairé
and
y el
curator
artista y
Stefan
curador
Benchuam
Stefan
in
Benchuam
Guatemala City.
en Ciudad de Guatemala.
It is housed in a
Funciona en una
peculiar
peculiar
egg-shaped
construcción en
construction
forma de
measuring
huevo,
2 meters
milímetros
by
altos
two and a
por
half
2,5
meters,
metros,
located in a
ubicada
shopping
en un
mall.
centro comercial.
Over the years,
A
the
lo largo de
museum has
los años,
developed
el
a
museo
relevant
desarrolló una
exhibition
relevante
program with
programación
local and also
expositiva con
international
artistas
artists.
locales y internacionales. Bueno, aquí
And here you can
enseño
see
algunas
some images and some of the exhibitions that they've done. You can also see this information on their website. Unlike the standardized model of the International Contemporary Art Museum dictated by Northwestern metropolitan precepts, the three museums mentioned above respond to contingencies, debates, and concrete materialities of their scenes, specifically to the lack of a contemporary art museum. They are the first in their cities prior to MAC Lima 2013 or MACBA 2012 in Buenos Aires, both museums with physical venues in their own cities, and they follow the globally standardized parameters for this type of institution. Unlike the hegemonic paradigm, the museal device set in motion by Limac, La N, and Numu manifests itself through reduced nomadic or fictitious architectural enclosures and through dematerialized collections or collections configured from the copy. Another of the particularities of these museums are the crossings they establish between artistic and curatorial practices, also very present in the constitution of the so-called self-managed projects or independent spaces founded by artists, especially belonging to the younger generations. These initiatives guide a way of doing art that doesn't focus on the production of works, but on the design of exhibition, educational, and editorial programs. Thus, they outline the margins of an institutionality that is sustained on a small scale, crossed by effective ties with less hierarchical and collective organizational structures with restricted budgets, and mostly located in non-centralized urban areas. The work involved in managing an initiative of this type through the design and development of exhibition and educational content is taken on by the artists as part of their practice and not merely as an administrative task. A sustained reason for the emergence of several independent or self-managed spaces in Latin American cities is to compensate for the absence of places dedicated to contemporary and emerging artistic practices. In this sense, they have a critical attitude towards cultural policies and their lack of infrastructure dedicated to art, as do Limac, La N, and Numu. Although the cases analyzed make the use of the category Contemporary Art Museum to name themselves, they are characterized by the fact that they function as self-managed initiatives or artistic projects. Thus, the museum devices they propose are located between practices, that is to say, in a space of tension that moves between the artistic production, curatorial practice, and self-management. A movement between practices that appears as an undefined place and therefore not fixed, contrary to what we usually understand by museum as a space of stabilization, fixation, and therefore static. In historical terms, the foundation of museums in Latin America under the European and North American museum model was not necessarily adapted to the possibilities and conditions, especially in terms of budget and infrastructure, of most of its cities. This led to the formation of weak, unstable, or even non-existent institutions in permanent deficit or incompleteness when compared with the Northwestern Museum canon. However, it was these conditions of instability or institutional vacuum, more or less pronounced depending on the case of each country, that made it possible, as Ticio Escobar rightly describes, and I quote, to imagine other museum models alternative to the one based on the classical Western paradigm. Close quotes. In the 80s, the critic and curator Gustavo Buntings coined the concept of museum vacuum to point out the non-existence of a museum of modern and contemporary art in the city of Lima. The museum void is affirmed in the same sense that Escobar points out, not from a lack of or deficiency, but as a space of possibility. In the words of Buntings, and I quote, a gap from which nevertheless fantasies and initiatives that activate the critical imagination flow, close quote. The museum vacuum or void gave rise to a series of projects created by artists in Peru called museotopias, which according to Buntings are defined as an institutional non-place that is activated as a critical and factual museality, different from the ironic or conceptual dismantling of the idea of the museum so recurrent in the hegemonic centers of art. Among the Peruvian museotopias are the Micromuseo, Al Fondo Hay Sitio, created by Gustavo Buntings himself, Museo Hawaii by Fernando Bryce in 1999, Museo Neo-Inca by Susana Torres Marquez, 1999, Limac by Sandra Gamarra, included as one of the case studies from 2002, the Transvestite Museum by Giuseppe Campuzano, probably one of the most well-known cases, and it's from 2003, and the Puno Moca by Cesar Cornejo from 2007. Therefore, this museum void or vacuum makes critical imagination possible through museum models that question the modern and contemporary Metropolitan Museum, understood as proposed by Carla Pinochet Cobos as a regulatory fiction, which is assumed as an ideal and universal prototype. The activation of this critical imagination is not done from an exclusively conceptual, ironic perspective to an already existing model, but as a questioning that is formulated in the very act of instituting musealities far from this model. In this way, they affirm other ways of conceiving the very notion of the museum. These strategies and discourses, pointed out by Buntings in the description of museotopias as an institutional non-place with respect to an academic or real estate affiliation, result in a critical institutionalism. This is present in Limac as part of the Peruvian museotopias, but also in La N and Numu, which emerge as a critical response of a group of young artists and curators to the absence of a contemporary art museum in their contexts. Limac, in Gamarra's words, and I quote, is an opportunistic project because it takes advantage of the absence of a contemporary art museum in the city to make it evident that the criticism generated by museums, art centers, biennials, and other such institutions is left aside by the seemingly simple fact of their existence. It is taken for granted that cities have museums, inaugurate art centers, or convene biennials, close quote. Here, Gamarra makes evident a critique that is exercised from a context where these institutions and events do not even exist. In the same way, La N arises, and I quote, as a critical commentary on the absence of a contemporary art museum in the city of Buenos Aires, and a stagnant institutionalism that did not offer possibilities of development, experimentation, or exhibition to the great majority of artists, revealing the shortcomings of the local art system, but also making concrete proposals to remedy them, close quote. On the other hand, Numu's founders state that this project, and I quote, questions what a museum is in general and what it entails to be a contemporary museum in the 21st century in the context of Guatemala City and the international art scene, close quote. In their words, Numu's mission is focused on providing the support necessary to carry out artistic projects despite the absence of local institutions and funding for the arts. As we see in the comments made by the members of the three museums, This points, on the one hand, to the absence of the museum institution, while at the same time questioning the internationally standardized contemporary museum device, materialized in spectacular buildings designed by renowned architects, the visual expression of the triumph of privatization often associated with processes of gentrification. On the other hand, in all three cases, the idea of an original collection that must be preserved is deviated, either through copy, as in Limac, or in materiality, as in La N. On the other hand, the crossing between practices mentioned before also calls into question the hierarchical structure of the functioning of a museum, subject to increasingly specialized processes. In this way, they propose other way of doing things that challenge the limits that usually define artistic and curatorial practices through blurred ways of doing that are typical of self-managed initiatives. These blurred limits, in turn, generate an estrangement with respect to the established category of museum, a capacity for estrangement that, as Nelly Hichard rightly points out, is characteristic of all critical practice, a practice that is in permanent mismatch or deviation from instituted experiences and knowledge. We are interested in taking up again the critical sense of the capacity for estrangement present in the three cases, which we understand as critical imagination, activated in the crossings or mix between practices and in the particularities of their architectures and collections as deviations from the regulatory fiction of the Northwestern Museum. The critical imagination, active through their artistic and curatorial practices, is not exercised here as a critique of something already instituted in their context, as would, for example, the so-called institutional critique in Northwestern countries of their existing museums, but rather operates in the very act of erecting institutionality. In this case, through musealities that respond to their particular artistic scenes. This critique, therefore, operates in two directions. That is, as a double critique, both of the absence of the contemporary museum device and of the standardized model of the International Contemporary Art Museum. That is all. Thank you very much.